Hi everybody!
With Ghost of Yotei having dropped last month and getting great reviews from critics, I thought now was the perfect time to discuss what the future holds for one of the PlayStation crown jewels, given Sucker Punch could go a whole host of directions. So let's explore that. What I think is the likeliest to happen will be the final segment of the video, so stick around for it. Given gamers are clamoring for samurai-based games in recent times, it would make a ton of sense for Sucker Punch to drive that home, since they have the experience and their releases are generally speaking well received. So why not explore it further? I'm working on a video discussing the rise of samurai video games, so hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss that. So, the time of the samurai lasted from around 700 AD right up to the late 1860s, with the Meiji Restoration. The last gasp for the samurai was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. One of my favorite Sabaton songs is actually about said rebellion, and it's called Shiroyama, and it's from the album The Last Stand. I highly recommend giving that song a listen, as it's one they always play during their concerts, and it's a fan favorite because the lyrics are not only emotional, but the guitar riff is one that's easily moshed to. Why am I discussing the Satsuma Rebellion though? That's because it's actually the perfect time period to set a third Ghost of game. Not only was it a time of upheaval for Japan, but it'd actually be an ideal game to cap off this samurai trilogy. Seriously, think about this. The first game, the much beloved Ghost of Tsushima, is set during the Mongol invasion of 1274. Ghost of Yotei is set in 1603, which is the beginning of the Edo period. So if a third game ends up being the last samurai-based game done by Sucker Punch, why not set it during the dying days of the samurai? It'd be a fitting send-off, and just like Ghost of Yotei is set a few hundred years after the events of Ghost of Tsushima, why not have a third game set a few hundred years after that? It'd give us 3 distinct time periods for the games to be set, and it gives Sucker Punch an excuse to iterate on the gameplay found within Ghost of Yotei, which, as we all know, introduces the use of gunplay. Another reason this would be a fitting bookend for the Ghost of series comes down to the fact we started with an epic battle for Jin's story, and whoever the protagonist for the third game ends up being can climax the series on a big battle. Specifically the Battle of Shiroyama, where the rebelling samurai were outnumbered 60-1. After the final skirmish, only 40 of Japan's noble warrior class were left. But honestly, the Satsuma Rebellion is the perfect era to set a game in. You have a lot of conflict, morally gray individuals, and the majority of the fights from that rebellion weren't pitched battles, meaning it's perfect for the mix of stealth and action this series has become known for. I do think Sucker Punch is likely to keep going with the Ghost of series, because they know they have a winning formula and they know gamers are hungry for more samurai adventures, making it pretty much inevitable we see another entry. But I don't think this will be their next project, simply because Sucker Punch always come up with a new IP each generation, and Ghost of Yotei is more of a spin-off from Ghost of Tsushima than it is a wholly new IP. Next, I'd like to discuss the possibility of a new Infamous game. We know from recent interviews with Sucker Punch management that a few staff members do want Infamous to come back. There are also pretty much limitless possibilities with this franchise, when you consider the first game had time travel, and the third game, known as Infamous Second Son, had a wholly new main character, meaning soft reboots are not outside the realm of possibility with this series. Also, I've always felt like the Infamous games, despite being great titles, were always let down by the hardware they were on. Now, I'm not saying the PlayStation 3 and 4 were bad consoles by any means. I'm just pointing out Sucker Punch have a tendency to push whatever hardware they're working on to its very limits. Yeah, all 3 Infamous games run pretty well, but they feel like they needed beefier hardware to accomplish some of their ambitions. When you consider the first protagonist, Cole McGrath, had electricity as his main power, and you can see why the first 2 games would have really benefited from ray tracing, which was 2 generations away from being a thing when the first 2 games came out, and almost a full decade from being realized when Second Son released. Second Son felt like it could have benefited from more enemies to engage with at any given time, since its interpretation of Seattle felt a little bit barren at points. That's also a complaint I have with the first Spider-Man game from Insomniac, which is a generational mate for Second Son. So just imagine what Sucker Punch could do with a brand new Infamous title if they did revisit it. The game would benefit from being ray tracing capable, as that'd just improve the looks of whatever effects are light-based. And since a lot of superhero powers incorporate that in some way, that'd just be nice. We also know the PS5 can absolutely cram an area full of enemies to interact with, so that's not a problem at all. It's also capable of doing insane stuff with particle effects. Just do some research into Marvel's Wolverine when you get a chance, as we discussed in a podcast on my friend's channel where we break down the most recent state of play at the time of recording, and we both pointed out Wolverine feels like a game that's truly pushing what the PS5 is capable of. Also, like I said in a previous video of mine, Infamous could easily come back, and it'd make a lot of sense. Sure, people are getting a little tired of superhero media in general right now, but Infamous could actually be a kind of counterculture response to modern superhero properties, just like James Gunn's take on Superman is a counterculture response to what's being done in the Marvel Cinematic Universe at present. Overall, I do think Infamous has an outside shot of being the next project they work on, but I'm also not convinced it is what they're going to do, given the interviews were rather coy as to where Infamous stands with Sucker Punch at present. But I do believe some company under the PlayStation umbrella is doing something with the IP, so we'll just have to wait and see. I'm not going to spend very much time with this next entry, as I know it's a complete non-starter. It's not going to be Sly Cooper. Also, since enough of you are asking, I don't have any news regarding the damned IP at present, so stop asking. And if and when I hear something I'm allowed to say about it, I'll bloody well do so. Now sod off. So moving on, I think there is a very strong chance we see Sucker Punch moving on to a brand new IP. This is because they mostly do a new franchise every generation. The PS5 is currently 5 years old at the time of recording. Games usually take 3 to 5 years to make, and they took around 5 to make Ghost of Yotei. This would mean Sucker Punch may have moved on to the PS6 hardware. However, I don't think that's the case. In fact, I think if any PS6 games are currently in development from any of the PlayStation studios, they're probably in the very earliest stages of development, and we're probably going to get at least 1 to 3 more games from these studios on PS5 hardware. When you consider the PS5 really didn't launch to the best of circumstances, the pandemic caused a chip shortage, which made the PS5 damn near impossible to get for most people until late 2022. With steady production really only being reached in 2023, meaning they're really only in the second year where the PS5 has had any real market presence. And despite those circumstances and having a perceived lack of games, the PS5 is still the 11th best-selling console of all time. But it's also this perception of the PS5 lacking games that makes me believe we're going to see more titles from first-party PlayStation developers. Under normal circumstances, Year 6 is when we start to see a heavy flood of games coming out, since developers will have been working on these games for years, and they want to really make the console look good just before it gets discounted when the next system comes out. But if the PS6 was close, I imagine we'd have experienced an avalanche of games that are PS5 exclusives. We really haven't. In fact, this whole generation has pretty much been a light trickle of games here and there, with a lot of the early PS5 releases also being cross-generational, because PlayStation needed to also release those exclusives on PS4 just because they needed to if those games hoped to be profitable in any way. If that hadn't been the case, the PS5 would have one of the strongest libraries of all time, but as it stands, it really hasn't had very many killer exclusives. This is also backed up by the fact it's only within the last handful of months the PS5 has more players on it than the PS4, because the average consumer literally saw no reason to upgrade until recently. I know I've really babbled for this section, but when you consider all of these factors, it makes it more likely Sucker Punch will have had a B team working on another project, which, sure, it could be a new Infamous game, or even a remake. But PlayStation have other studios more specialized in remakes, and like I said earlier in this video, Sucker Punch are known to bring something new to the table each generation. The fact we got a new Infamous game before the PS4 was even a year old makes me think lightning will strike twice, and we're going to see something totally new from Sucker Punch before the PS5 inevitably gets replaced. I also feel like this is the likeliest course Sucker Punch will take, as they do tend to make a new franchise every generation. And if anyone can make a game that really pushes what can be done with the PlayStation 5, it's them. But do you think Sucker Punch will do a sequel, revisit an old classic, or do something entirely new for their next project? Sound off in the comments, and maybe consider watching my video where I discuss why Infamous should return. And until next time, keep blazing that trail.